Hello, welcome. It's 5 o'clock. It's Wednesday, and it's time for another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. I wonder what you've all been getting up to today. I went into the city where I live, which is Salisbury, which is quiet at the best of times, although I guess not when we have summer visitors, but it's not, it's not London, it's not Bristol. It's certainly not any of the northern cities. So yeah, it's pretty quiet. It's a cathedral city. But today I went in because I needed to go to the post office. It's the first time I've actually been into the city centre, to the post office, since the schools closed, actually. So nearly 4 weeks, actually. And of course in that time all the cafes have closed, all the restaurants have closed. It was really, really surreal. There were a few people about, but it was like a ghost town. And I'm sure it's like that where you are. So if you're stuck at home because your parents won't let you go out, then never fear, you're not missing anything in town. At least it's really, really strange. So yeah, that's one of the things I've done today. I also, where I live, we look out over fields, which is lovely, really nice, except at this time of year when it's slightly less romantically lovely, because the farmer has been out with his tractor all day with his huge cylinder on the back, spreading poo on the fields. Or, I mean, maybe it's not actually poo, but that's what it smells like. So yeah, we've got the windows open in the house, but it's quite fragrant. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I love it, but you do kind of notice when the farmer's out. Anyway, so we're here. My internet connection seemed a bit dicky today. I'm not quite sure why. It dropped out a minute ago. We're here, and again, I dare not say it. I was going to say we're here for another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn, but all 3 times I've tried to say that, the internet connection has dropped out, as though it wants to stop me. I hope it doesn't. So yeah, we're on to chapter 3 of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. This is set in the Viking Age, as some of you will remember. Joe has gone home with the girl he met, whose name is Luishak, and she is definitely Lucy, only she doesn't remember him. So he's gone home with her. He recognises the members of her family. They've all got different names, and because they're Vikings instead of Romans, they're now fair-haired. The men are fair-haired, which before they were dark. So they are different, and yet the same. So he says the same, but not the same. So he's gone home with them. The food is awful, really, really awful. And the beer, because everybody drank beer in those days, and for hundreds of years afterwards, actually, unless you were lucky enough to have a well on your property, then probably you would drink beer, because the water that you would draw from any public well or from rivers or streams was quite polluted, because everybody basically weed into the streams and pooed in the streams and, washed their clothes, and all sorts of stuff ended up in the waterways, and so the water would make you very ill. So the people's solution to that was to drink beer, and that included children. Joe doesn't enjoy it much, ever. It's not very alcoholic, not like the beer that you might drink today. It's pretty low alcohol level, but I suspect it's fairly horrible all the same. Anyway, okay, so yeah, he's had a meal and now he's gone to bed. Chapter 3. Joe woke up the next morning feeling a good deal better. The wide earth banks at the sides of the room had been spread with sheepskins last night, making a surprisingly soft, warm bed. They had slept in pairs, Lucy with Surka, her mother with Anya, and he himself with Peda. To begin with, he'd lain rigidly still, afraid that when he slept he might roll into Peda or accidentally cuddle up to him. But after a while he'd realised it was much the same as sharing Dad's sofa bed with Sam. The only difference was that he and Peda shared one large, thick blanket, rather than each having their own sleeping bag. When Joe awoke, the room was cold, and he was glad of the warmth he'd had from Peda. Sleeping alone in a house like this would be rather chilly. Lucy's mother and Sorka were already up and dressed, conjuring the fire back to life. Without the light from it, the room was very dark. Joe lay on his back, looking up at the sky through the hole in the roof. Daylight filtered through the chinks in the wall. He wondered what time it was and went to look at his watch. It wasn't there, of course, having disappeared with the rest of what he'd been wearing in his own world. It was probably around dawn, he guessed from the greyness of the light, which would make it something like 7 o'clock. For a moment he wondered whether they had changed their clocks here on the same date as at home. Then he realised that was a stupid question. More than likely, they didn't even count the hours at all. Last night they'd gone to bed soon after dinner, not long after it had got dark, and they seemed to be getting up now as it got light. That, at least, was the same as it had been in Lucy's time before. He frowned to himself. He had to stop thinking about the time at Fishbourne as Lucy's time. This was Lucy's time now. He sat up and pulled on his trousers and tunic over his linen undershirt and shorts. Peder groaned at the draught of cold air and pulled the blanket down around him. "Time to get up, lazy bones," said Sorka, coming over and prodding her brother. "You too." She twitched the covers that lay over Lucy and Anya. There was a chorus of complaint. Joe grinned as he pulled on his shoes over the strange sleeve-like socks on his feet. He rubbed his arms, glad of the thickness of his tunic for keeping the cold out. "Good morning," he said shyly to Lucy's mother. "Hello, Joe. How are you?" "Fine, thanks. Can I do something to help?" "Could you milk the goat?" she said. Then, seeing his face, she hesitated. "Or do you not know how to? Don't you have a goat at home? Or a cow? Or even a sheep?" He shook his head. "Never mind." She smiled. "Louishak will show you how, and then you can do it. Come on, girl," she called to Lucy. "Time to get out of bed." Lucy sat up, her hair tousled. She looked around sleepily. "Coming," she yawned. Joe put on his cloak and went out through the back door. Behind the house was a long, narrow yard. He spluttered. It smelled disgusting out here. The same rank stench of rotting food and filth that had been in the street last evening. He hadn't realised how much better it had been inside, with the smell of smoke covering almost everything else. Near the house was a chicken coop and a lean-to shelter where the goat was tethered. Halfway down the yard was a sort of cubicle made from wattle, about the same height as Joe. It was arranged as 3 sides of a square, with the open side facing away from the house. It had no roof. Beyond it, down at the far end, was a pig in a pen, and beside that a heap of what looked a bit like compost. A rat stood on the top of the heap, twitching its whiskers. Joe picked up a stone and hurled it. The whole heap seemed to move as a dozen or more rats he hadn't noticed vanished into their tunnels. The pig grunted and rolled over in his pen. "What are you doing?" Lucy was beside him. "Just scaring off a few rats?" She laughed. "That'll keep you busy all day. Even the dogs can't keep them down. Not that we let the dogs burrow in there. They'd start eating the rubbish." Joe pointed to the wattle construction. "What's that?" She looked at him intently. "You're not joking, are you?" she said after a moment. "You really don't know? It's the cesspit." "Cesspit?" It took Joe a moment to realise what she was talking about. "Oh! He wrinkled his nose. "You mean where you wee?" "You can, though there's a bucket for that in the house. We keep quite a bit of the pee for washing clothes. Out here's mainly for pooing." "There's no need to look like that." She sounded indignant. "It's quite a good one, actually. It has a plank seat, so you don't have to just squat over the hole." "Right." "Well, where do you go when you're at home?" "The bathroom, of course." "What, like public baths?" "No, not really. They're in our houses." Joe sighed. There was no point telling her about bathrooms and toilets and sinks and the clean water that came out when you turned on the tap. She couldn't possibly understand. "Do you really wash your clothes in wee?" he asked instead. "They must smell horrible." "It's good for soaking away dirt and oil. Then we use soap before we rinse them." "And what's that made from?" he asked, remembering the toothpaste and hair dye at Fishbourne. "Wood ash, mostly. or sometimes nettles when they're in season. Anyway, the cesspit is one of our jobs for today." "What?" The word came out as a squeak as Jo thought of having to shovel what was down the hole onto the heap. "Collecting more moss," she said. Moss? Her answer was so far from what he was expecting that he couldn't think what she was talking about. She giggled. "For wiping your backside, you nitwit. We'll fetch some from the place I usually go to, near the river. Now, though," she swung the pail she was holding, "it's time for milking." She put the bucket down beside the stool she'd brought out with her. Can you pull down a few handfuls of hay from that net under the roof over there?" She pointed. "I'll hobble the goat, then we can start." Jo did as he was told, pleased with himself for guessing correctly that the hay was for the goat to eat. It was obvious, too, where he was supposed to put it. He gave the goat a cautious scratch between the ears as it buried its nose in the basket hung from the tethering post. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I just told you, I'm hobbling her." Lucy had looped a leather strap around both of the goat's back legs and pulled it tight. "Doesn't that hurt her?" "Of course not. It's only like wearing a belt. She's a kicker, this one. If we don't do this, she'll knock the bucket flying, milk and all, and then everyone will be sorry. Now then." She pulled up the stool beside the animal and set the bucket down beneath its belly. "The udder has two sides," she said, "the right side and the left side. I milk the right side with my left hand and the left side with my right hand." "Right with left, left with right," repeated Jo, pretending to understand. "So," Lucy went on, "I squeeze this teat with this hand. Then I let it go so that it fills up again, while I squeeze this one with this hand." She began to milk the goat. Jo watched, listening to the rhythmic squirt of the milk into the pail beneath. It looked quite easy. "Your turn." She stood up. "Don't I need to wash my hands or something?" She shook her head. "Why would you do that?" "I don't know. Hygiene, I suppose." "What's hygiene?" He sat down on the stool. "Forget it." He took hold of the goat's teats. They felt squishy, like the fingers of a rubber glove which had been filled with water, except that they were warm and slightly downy instead of rubbery. "Not that one." Lucy grinned. "Those teats are both on the same side. You'll end up with one side empty and the other side still full. Here." She guided his hand to the right place. "Now squeeze." Jo did as she said. Nothing happened. "Her milk's gone. She's dried up. She must be frightened of me, just like the dogs." Lucy laughed. "She looks fine to me. You've just squeezed the milk back up inside her rather than out through the end of the teat." She bent down. "You need to close it off at the top by pinching it with your finger and thumb, like this." She showed him. "Then squeeze the milk down by curling your other fingers around it." Jo tried again. This time milk sprayed all over his leg. "And you have to aim for the bucket." Lucy was still laughing. "It's all right for you," he said crossly. "This isn't as easy as it looks." "I suppose not." She did her best to keep a straight face as the next squirt shot over the top of the bucket onto the ground. "Stop laughing, will you? You must have had to learn once." Jo grappled with the pink sack which seemed to keep escaping from him. "Easy on her." Lucy sprang forward. "Don't pull, you'll hurt her. Just squeeze. And remember, if you get annoyed, she'll get tense and then the milk won't come down." She stepped back again. "I'm sorry for laughing. I suppose I must have been shown what to do once, but it's so long ago I don't remember it. Shall I leave you to have a go on your own for a bit?" "Yes," Jo huffed. He'd be bound to do better without her looking over his shoulder and making fun of him. For some time he squeezed and squeezed the goat's udder. Sometimes the milk came through, sometimes it didn't. The sound on the bucket was certainly a lot less regular than it had been when Lucy did it, and the level of the milk was rising painfully slowly. Very soon his hands ached. Inside he seethed. The trouble with coming into Lucy's world was that it was always one way, always him learning how to do something that she already knew how to do. It made him feel so stupid. And it wasn't even as though he could build on the skills he was acquiring. He thought of the hours he'd spent scraping letters in wax with his stylus under the fierce eye of the teacher at Fishbourne. When would that ever be useful again? And when would he ever be asked again to milk a goat? There was no point in learning all these things. After a while, Lucy came out again. "Do you want to get her some more hay while I finish off?" she said tactfully. She sat down on the stool. Immediately Joe heard the rhythmic swish of the milk squirting into the bucket. "Here you are," she said after a couple of minutes. She motioned to him to take the pail and bent to unstrap the goat's back legs. "Don't worry," she said, seeing Joe's expression. "You can try again tomorrow. Now, while we're out here, we need to check in the hen house for eggs." She unfastened the catch on the chicken coop and reached into the nest boxes. The chickens hopped down and flapped straight to the rubbish heap at the end of the yard. Joe watched them go. At least if he was asked to do this, he would know now where to find the eggs and not to panic about the chickens escaping. "Will we have those for breakfast?" he asked, nodding to the 4 white eggs Lucy had brought out. "No." She looked faintly scandalised. "They're to sell or exchange for things we need, like flour or honey. We only eat eggs once a week, and that's not today." They went back into the house. The fire was properly alight now, and the room smelled of smoke again. It occurred to Joe that he'd stopped noticing the stench outside while he'd been trying to milk the goat. Perhaps he would get used to this place after all, just as he got used to being at Fishbourne. "Breakfast will be a good while yet," said Lucy's mother, seeing him looking around hopefully. "Pedder's only just got back from the river with the water for the porridge. Perhaps you could chop some kindling." Joe nodded and picked up the small axe she pointed to, before she could guess that this was something else he hadn't done before. While he was out in the yard again, trying to shave strips off the logs he'd found beneath the eaves, he wondered why the porridge was taking so long. His mother cooked it in about 10 minutes at home, and used milk rather than water because she said it was nicer. It was about another hour, he guessed, before they sat down in front of their bowls of lumpy grey slop. He was ravenous. At home he usually had breakfast as soon as he was dressed, rather than working for 2 hours first. But within a few chewy mouthfuls his appetite had almost disappeared. The porridge tasted as grey as it looked, despite the honey Lucy's mother had added to sweeten it, and he had to force himself to eat it all. What was the point in milking the goat before breakfast, he wondered, if you weren't going to use the milk? As he and Lucy set off through the streets towards the gates out of Jorvik, he felt glum. "So we have to get moss and more firewood," she chirped, "and we'll check all the traps again." She grinned at him. "It's lovely not to have to carry everything for myself for once." Joe plodded along beside her and said nothing. The basket she'd used to carry the hare was strapped to his back instead of hers this morning. "What's the matter?" she asked. "Did you want to go fishing with Pedder instead?" "No, I'd sooner be with you." "Really?" She looked doubtful. "It doesn't seem like it." "Sorry." Joe tried to pull himself together. "Everything's just a bit new for me, that's all. Where I come from, you see, it's really nothing like here at all. The food's different, the houses are different, pretty much everything is different." Her eyes widened. "Will you tell me about it, please? I love stories about other places. I've never been anywhere away from Jorvik." Joe was tempted. This would be his chance to impress her. If only he could find a way of describing it so that she understood. It would make up for him not being able to milk the goat or chop the kindling, and for all the things he'd already said that she obviously thought were idiotic. But just as he was about to begin, he looked up to see a boy a few years older than himself coming towards them along the street. The boy had curly blonde hair and walked with a swagger. He was looking at Joe and Lucy with the kind of cocky satisfaction of a bully looking at his victim. Joe dropped his gaze to the ground. His heart thudded. That curl of the lip, the malice in the eyes. He was sure he recognised them. This boy might be blonde rather than dark, but everything else about him was the same. Just as Pedda was Petrus and Anya was Antonia, this had to be Tiberius. He elbowed Lucy. "What? Who's that?" he hissed, still keeping his eyes averted. Lucy looked up. Jo sensed her tense beside him. "Actually," she said loudly, "we need to go this way." She took Jo's arm and dragged him down a narrow alley which led away from the main track. "Was that a good idea?" Jo whispered. "What if he follows us?" "Just hurry up," Lucy hissed back. "We don't want to run, but if we speed up a bit we'll be able to lose him." Jo quickened his pace to keep up with her. It was difficult to walk much faster without slipping and sliding in the muck and water that ran down the alley. As they reached the end, he glanced over his shoulder. The boy had not followed them, but stood on the track at the point where they had turned off, watching. His mouth was twisted into a wide, cruel smile. "Come on," Lucy urged. "It's okay, I don't think he's coming after us." "All the same, we have to get as far away from him as we can. Make sure he can't tell where we're going. Outside the city walls there isn't much cover, and if he's waiting for us when we come back this evening, we'll be in really big trouble." So that's the end of the chapter. Some of you will know very well who he's met if you've listened to or read The Leopard in the Golden Cage. This boy, this Tiberius, obviously he's not Tiberius this time, but Jo knows this means trouble. This definitely means trouble. This time, though, we don't know what his relationship is to Lucy or to Lucy's family. So we'll have to find out. We'll find out tomorrow, I think. Let me have a quick peep. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. We're definitely going to find out tomorrow. Interesting. Okay. Well, it's nice to see you. And I'll be back tomorrow. Same time, same place, 5 o'clock. For another chapter of Saving the Unicorn's Horn. I haven't got it to hand. If any of you are interested in finding out more about the Viking period or anything like that, there is a website for this series. If you search for Scar Gatherer, which is the name of the series, you will find it. I do have a piece of paper somewhere with it written on, but it's out of my reach at the moment. So yeah, that's all for now. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a nice evening.